The north was never meant to be quiet, but on this grey morning, Winterfell stood still like a grave. Snow drifted gently over the high walls, and the cold air felt sharper than ever. Jon Snow, now crowned king in the north and warden of the realm, stood before the great hall's stone throne, his face colder than the winter outside. Across from him stood his brother, Robb Stark, once the young wolf, once the king in the north, once a name that inspired songs and fear. But now Robb stood as a prisoner of Winterfell, wrists bound, cloak torn and eyes full of fire. "You should be dead," Jon finally spoke, voice deep and steady. Robb didn't blink. "I was. They all think I am. But I lived, Jon. I bled. I crawled. I survived." The hall was filled with silent lords and bannermen. Arya stood at Jon's side, eyes narrowed. Sansa remained seated behind, lips pressed tight, as if forcing herself not to speak. Ghost growled low from the shadows. Jon stepped forward, his cloak trailing behind. "You betrayed the North," he said. "You broke your oath. You married a Frey girl during war, ignored your allies, and then disappeared after the Red Wedding like a ghost." "I didn't disappear. I was hunted, nearly killed. I survived in Essos, trying to gather strength to return." "You returned when the war was over." "When the throne was mine," Jon interrupted. "You didn't come home for your people. You came for power." Robb's jaw tightened. "It was never about power. It was about taking back what was mine." That word, mine, stung through the hall like wildfire. Jon nodded slowly. "Then you leave me no choice." Sansa looked up sharply, but Jon raised a hand. "I will not kill you, Robb. You are still of my blood. But I cannot let you stay here. I cannot let the North bleed again because of you." Robb laughed bitterly. "So what then? Execution's too soft? Will you lock me in the dungeons like a rat?" "No," Jon said. "You are to be banished." A loud murmur swept the hall. Even Arya's eyes widened. "Banished where?" Robb asked, voice low. "To the Shadowlands," Jon said. "Beyond Asshai, where no light touches the ground, where magic eats the living and the dead alike. You will leave today. You will not return. Ever." For the first time, fear flashed in Robb's eyes. "Jon, that's a death sentence." "No," Jon whispered. "It's mercy." The next morning, as dawn broke red over Winterfell, Robb Stark was dragged out through the gates. No banners flew for him. No songs were sung. Only the wind howled as his brother turned his back on him, and somewhere deep in the dark corners of the world, the Shadowlands waited. But what Jon didn't know was that in the land of shadows, the dead remember, and Robb Stark was not going to die quietly. The sea roared as the ship rocked violently, cutting through waves that seemed to rise like dark mountains. Robb Stark stood at the edge of the deck, chained and silent, staring into the nothingness beyond the sea. The voyage had been long, brutal, and filled with storms, as if the world itself wanted him gone. The sailors refused to speak to him. They called him cursed. Some didn't even look him in the eye. Word had spread that he was the Ghost King, the dead king who returned, only to be cast out by his own brother. Even among men hardened by the sea, Robb Stark made their skin crawl. The ship's destination was Asshai, and from there, Robb would be led into the Shadowlands, a place even maesters feared to name. It was a land of twisted beasts, blackened skies, and ancient whispers that drove men mad. No one returned from there. No ravens flew back. It was exile worse than death, but Robb wasn't thinking about death anymore. He was thinking about Jon. Jon Snow, the brother he had once held in his arms, trained with in the courtyard, laughed with around Winterfell fires. The boy who had once looked up to him with quiet loyalty. And now, the king who had stood above him, passed judgment on him and cast him out like filth. "Jon Snow is no Stark," Robb muttered to himself, his voice like gravel. He gripped the iron rail tightly. His knuckles turned white. A storm built in his chest, far darker than the one around him. He had returned home, not just to reclaim his name, but to warn the North. Something was coming from across the sea. He had seen it. Black ships with sails of bone, captains with no eyes, dead men walking beneath a red sky. The Red Priests in Essos called it the Dark Tide, but Robb was never allowed to speak. His trial had been swift. No one asked him what he'd seen. Jon had made up his mind long before Robb entered the hall. Now, no one would know. Not until it was too late, when the ship docked at Asshai. The sky had already begun to darken unnaturally. The city was a nightmare of twisted towers and long shadows, even at noon. The people wore veils, whispered in tongues, and their eyes glowed faintly under torchlight. The guards shoved Robb down the gangplank. A tall woman in a deep red robe stood waiting. Her skin was pale as moonlight, and her eyes, golden and without pupils, looked through him. "You are the Stark who walks beyond death," she said in a voice like silk soaked in. "Poison?" Robb didn't reply. "The shadows know you," she continued. "They whispered your name before you were born. And now you have come. Not by choice," he spat. She tilted her head. "It is never by choice. That is what makes it fate." She led him through crooked alleys, past markets that sold potions made from screams and cages filled with creatures that had too many eyes. Finally, they reached a black gate carved from obsidian and bone. Beyond it, the land opened up like a wound. The Shadowlands. It wasn't a desert. It wasn't a forest. It wasn't even land, not really. It was a place where light bent the wrong way, where the air felt thick like smoke, and the wind carried voices of the long dead. Robb felt it instantly, a pressure in his skull, like a whisper digging into his thoughts. She handed him a black sword, curved and jagged. "You'll need this," she said. "You will be hunted. But you will also remember who you are." Robb took the sword without a word. His eyes met hers, burning with something colder than rage. "I am Robb Stark," he said quietly. "Son of Eddard Stark, king in the north. And this is not my end." "No," she smiled, her lips curling with something between admiration and fear. "It is your beginning." Then she turned and vanished into the fog. Alone now, Robb stepped into the Shadowlands, and the darkness welcomed him like an old friend. In the far distance, something ancient stirred. Eyes opened in the deep. The land knew his name, and though Jon had sent him here to vanish, Robb Stark would rise again, not as a king, not as a brother, but as something far more dangerous. The ground beneath Robb's boots pulsed faintly with warmth, though there was no sun in the sky. The Shadowlands did not follow the laws of men or nature. The rocks whispered. The trees, if they could be called that, were shaped like bones, crooked, hollow, dripping black sap like blood. Nothing lived here, not in the way Westeros understood life, and yet everything watched. Robb walked for what felt like days, sword drawn, his senses stretched thin. Sleep was rare. Hunger felt strange here, dull and distant, like a memory of being human. And the whispers, gods, the whispers, they came from every shadow, from every corner of his mind. Wolf King. Blood betrayed? Cast down. At first he thought he was going mad, but madness would have been a relief. This felt worse. It felt like he was being shaped, like the shadows were molding him into something else. His dreams were filled with faces, his mother soaked in river water, Jordan with a crown of ice and fire, Arya standing in blood, but none spoke. They only watched. On the fourth day he found the first creature. It was not a beast, not quite. It looked like a man, but stretched. Its limbs were too long, its eyes glowing red, and its mouth opened sideways like a slit in cloth. It stood between two crumbling stones that might have once been a gate, guarding something ancient. Robb raised the black sword. The creature tilted its head, curious. It did not speak, but its presence pressed against Robb's mind like a hammer. "You do not belong here," it whispered inside his skull. Robb stepped forward, voice steady. "Neither do you." And then it lunged. Their fight wasn't like any battle he'd fought in Westeros. The creature moved with smoke-like speed, twisting around blows, phasing in and out of view. But the sword it sang in his hand, it drank the darkness, glowed faintly with blue veins. And every time he struck, the creature screamed like the wind through broken bones. When it finally fell, dissolving into ash, Robb stood over it, breathing hard. His knuckles bled, but he felt clearer, stronger, like the shadows had taken a part of him but given something back from behind the stones. A voice called out, "You fight like a king." Robb turned sharply. An old man stood in the shadow of the gate, dressed in tattered black robes, a necklace of obsidian shards hanging around his neck. His eyes were blind and white, yet he stared at Robb as if he saw every truth hidden in him. "Who are you?" Robb demanded. "I am no one," the man replied. "But long ago, I was a servant of House Stark, before the world forgot what power your bloodline held." Robb narrowed his eyes. "Starks have no power here." "No?" The man smiled. "Then why do the shadows bow to your step? Why do the dead whisper your name?" Robb said nothing. The man limped closer. "You were banished. Unjustly, cast aside. But this place, it remembers betrayal, and it rewards the broken." He reached into his robe and pulled out a scroll sealed with black wax. "You were sent here to die, but I offer you a path to return, not as the boy who lost the North, but as something they will never forget." Robb stared at the scroll. His fingers itched. "What is it?" "Knowledge. A way back. Through blood. Through shadow. You can walk through the black gate and come out where no man should. But the cost," the old man's voice lowered. "You will not return as you were. You will return as a creature of both light and dark. Half wolf, half shadow." Robb hesitated. Then he took the scroll. The old man smiled wider. "The North took everything from you, my king. Let it learn the cost of betrayal." That night, Robb sat by a fire that burned blue. The scroll unrolled in his lap, etched in a language older than old Valyria. It spoke of a ritual, of shadow blood, of memory and bone. It was madness. But then again, the world had already gone mad. He thought of Jon, of being chained in his own hall, of Sansa looking away, of Arya saying nothing. He had bled for them, died for them, and they had cast him into the dark. Now, he would return, but not as Robb Stark. He would return as the Wraith Wolf of the North, and winter would no longer come gently. The ritual had begun long before Robb even realized it. From the moment his blood spilled onto the black stone floor beneath the broken moon, the Shadowlands had started taking root inside him. But now, with the scroll opened and the ancient words crawling through his thoughts like worms, there was no turning back. He stood in the middle of a ruined circle, once a temple, perhaps now just jagged pillars and shadowed carvings that wept red in the moonlight. The old man, the one who called himself No One, stood at the edge of the circle, chanting in a dead language that twisted the air into knots. Robb had carved the sigils into his skin with the black blade, not out of obedience, but because the rage inside him had no other path. He was a Stark, but more than that now. They had called him a ghost, a mistake, a threat. Jon had sent him to rot. Now he would become something the world would fear. A sudden burst of wind spiraled through the ruins, thick with ash. The flame in the blue fire pit flared high, turning violet. Robb gritted his teeth as the darkness pulled at him, not like a wind or a physical force, but something internal. It was like his very soul was being torn in half and stitched back together with shadows. He fell to his knees, breath ragged. The sword beside him pulsed, humming as if alive. He reached out to grab it, and as soon as his fingers closed around the hilt, he saw. Not visions, not memories. He saw Winterfell burning. He saw Jon Snow alone on the battlements, sword drawn. His eyes haunted. He saw Arya drenched in blood, fighting something not human. He saw Sansa sobbing behind the throne, crown shattered in her lap, and in the shadows around them, things moved. Tall, black-eyed creatures wearing faces like masks, cloaked in silence and decay. Creatures he had seen before, on the edges of the world, in the cursed lands east of Essos, where death had no meaning. The dark tide had reached Westeros, and Jon didn't even see it coming. Robb let out a scream, not from fear, but fury. He slammed the blade into the earth, and the shadows around him erupted like smoke, forming wolves, huge, monstrous beasts of pure darkness, eyes glowing red. They snarled in silence, circling him, not attacking, guarding. The ritual was complete. No one stepped forward, staring at Robb as if seeing a god reborn. "You are no longer just a Stark," the old man said, voice trembling. "You are the bridge between light and shadow." The Wraith wolf. Robb stood slowly, skin pale, his eyes darker now, like storm clouds hiding fire. He looked down at his hands. The scars from the carvings had already healed, but the skin glowed faintly in the moonlight. Something inside him had changed. He didn't feel cold anymore, or fear, only a quiet purpose. "I need to return," Robb said. The old man nodded. "There is one gate, forgotten, forbidden, the black vein beneath Asshai. It leads back to Westeros, but not through land, through memory, through death." Robb didn't hesitate. "Take me to it." 3 days later they stood before the black vein. It was not a tunnel or a cave. It was a tear in the world itself, floating in mid-air, pulsing like a wound. Black mist poured out of it, and every now and then a whisper slipped through, like a dying man begging for his name. Robb stared into it, sword in hand. "Once you go through," no one warned, "oh, you may not return as a man." Robb looked back at him with cold certainty. "Oh, good. I'm not a man anymore." He stepped into the vein, and the world screamed. On the other side, darkness swallowed him whole. Not a void, not silence, but noise. Screams, steel, fire, crying, all around him. He was inside a memory. Not his, but the land's. Westeros itself remembered everything. Every war, every betrayal, every king crowned and killed. Robb walked through it like a ghost, past echoes of Egon's fire. Through the Red Wedding again, past his own dying breath. He saw his mother's last scream, heard grey wind howl in agony as arrows pierced his flesh. He walked through the pain, each step heavier than the last, until, like a break in the shadows, he stepped through and fell, gasping, onto snow-covered stone. He was back. Winterfell. But different. It was night. The wind was howling. The castle was under siege. Shadows moved along the walls. Real ones this time. Not soldiers. The dark tide had arrived, and Jon Snow was alone. Robb stood, eyes burning. He had returned, but not to forgive. To save the North from what they could not see, and to make his brother answer for what he had done. The snow fell in sheets, thick as ash, as Robb Stark rose from the frozen ground outside the Godswood. The weirwood tree, once the heart of Winterfell's soul, looked pale and twisted now, its red eyes bleeding tears into the snow. But even beneath that sacred face, the air reeked of rot. Something had changed. The land itself felt bruised. Winterfell was under siege, but not by men, not by any army Robb recognized. From the walls came no horns, no war cries, no fire arrows streaking the sky. Only silence, an unnatural, choking silence. And from the tree line beyond the moat, shapes moved, too tall, too thin, too quiet. The dark tide was already here. Robb's shadow wolves flanked him. 6 massive beasts of smoke and rage, their red eyes scanning the night like torches. The mist curled around them, but didn't dare touch them. He looked up at the towering walls of Winterfell. His home, his grave, and somewhere up there, Jon Snow, brother king, betrayer. Robb didn't head for the gates. They were sealed, bound with blackened chains and spells older than old Nan's bedtime stories. No, he walked with purpose toward the secret path beneath the crypts, the same path he'd used as a child when he and Jon would sneak out to hunt rabbits in the woods. Only now, he was not a boy, and he wasn't coming back with rabbits. The crypts were colder than he remembered. He moved like a whisper between the carved faces of dead Starks, their statues silent and judging. His footsteps echoed, not loudly, but just enough to remind him that he was no longer a ghost here. He had weight again, a presence, and it disturbed the dead. From the shadows behind Lyanna Stark's tomb, a shape stirred. Robb froze. It wasn't one of the shadow wolves. They waited above this thing, this man. Had no eyes, only a stitched-up mask, and a necklace of severed tongues. "You shouldn't have come back," it rasped. Robb raised his blade. "And yet here I stand," the creature hissed, stepping forward. "The dark tide claimed the crypts first. The bones of your ancestors are now ash in the mouths of gods that never had names. You serve them. I serve their hunger, and it begins with you." It lunged. Robb met it with fury. Their blades clashed with a sound like thunder in a coffin. The creature moved fast, inhuman, its limbs snapping and bending at wrong angles. But Robb's sword was forged in the Shadowlands. It cut through memory, through illusions, through death. 3 strikes, 1 scream, and the creature collapsed in smoke. Robb stood over it, heart steady, breath slow. The shadows whispered louder now. "He has returned," above Winterfell groaned. The castle itself felt alive, sick, pulsing, waiting. He emerged in the great hall. It was nearly unrecognizable. Tapestries torn, stone blackened with soot, the air thick with ash and whispers. Fires crackled in the corners, but their light seemed tired. The high table was shattered. And on the throne of Winterfell he saw Jon Snow. His brother looked older, harder, his hair longer, streaked with grey. His cloak torn, sword across his knees. And beside him only 2 remained, Arya, face cold as ice, a blade in each hand, and Bran, silent in his chair, eyes milky white, staring at nothing, or everything. Jon rose when he saw Robb. His expression didn't change. "I knew you'd come back," Jon said quietly. "You knew and still sent me to die?" Robb replied. Stepping into the hall, "You weren't ready," Jon said. "You were angry. You would have torn the North apart." "I was the North," Robb snapped. "Before you wore that crown, before you turned your back on blood," Arya stepped between them. "We don't have time for this. They're already inside the walls." "Then let them come," Robb said, his shadow wolves growling as they entered behind him. "Let them see what the North really is." Jon stared at him, eyes dark. "You've changed. So have you. Are you here to save us or to take my throne?" Robb didn't answer, because the truth was tangled. He had come for both, to save what was left of Winterfell, and to make Jon answer. But before another word could be spoken, the walls screamed, a sound like 1,000 children crying out in one breath. The dark tide had breached the gates. The time for words was over. The walls trembled. It wasn't from siege towers or catapults. No iron ram beat the gate. No army of men howled in bloodlust. No, this was different, worse. The stones moaned like they were afraid. The very bones of Winterfell, ancient and proud, wept under the weight of what crawled through them now. Jon Snow gripped Longclaw tighter as the scream echoed again, high-pitched, unnatural, like grief and hunger tangled into one. He glanced at Bran, whose pale eyes remained distant. The 3-eyed raven was here, but not here. His mind stretched across time, seeing too much. Arya didn't flinch. Her face was steel, but Robb could see it. Her breathing was faster than usual. Her blades were steady, but her knuckles white. Then came the silence, a suffocating, horrible calm. Robb turned his eyes toward the broken archway that led to the courtyard. Snow drifted in. Something was out there, watching. A whisper, no louder than a breath, slithered through the air. "Brother." A figure stepped forward through the arch. It wore Robb's face, his armor, his smile. But its eyes were all wrong. Hollow, glowing. Arya stepped back instinctively. Jon stepped forward. "Is that—" Robb shook his head. "It's not me." The creature grinned. "Oh, but I was." "I remember you, Robb. I remember every bone that broke under the twins, every scream, every betrayal. And I remember your last thought." It stepped closer, dragging something behind it, Grey Wind's head, stitched crudely to a twisted black body. Its jaws twitched, empty of breath. Jon raised Longclaw. "Dark magic." Robb stepped between them. "It's a shadow made of my pain. The tide is playing games." "Then let's stop playing," Arya hissed, and vanished into the darkness. A flash of movement, her dagger gleamed in mid-air, but the thing was fast. Too fast. It caught her wrist mid-strike and flung her across the hall like a doll. She hit the stone with a grunt. Robb didn't wait. He moved like a storm, the black blade in his hand glowing brighter than fire. The shadow creature hissed and met him in a blur of claw and fury. They clashed in the center of the hall, steel against nothingness, rage against mimicry. Every strike sent waves of cold across the chamber. Jon jumped in, swinging Longclaw with brutal precision. The 3 of them 2 kings and a shadow of one fought as wolves under a dying moon. Bran whispered from his chair, voice low, lost in vision. They are not just here to kill us. They want our names, our history. Robb didn't look away as he slammed his sword into the creature's chest. Then let's make sure they choke on it. The creature stumbled back. Smoke poured from its wound, but it didn't fall. It laughed. You left me in the dark, it rasped at Robb. Now I'll leave you in pieces. But before it could strike again, a howl tore through the hall. One of Robb's shadow wolves launched itself at the creature, jaws wide. It tackled the doppelganger to the ground, teeth sinking into its false face. It screeched, unraveling like a torn curtain, body splitting into ribbons of black wind. Robb stood over it as the last of it vanished into smoke. Silence fell. Arya groaned from the floor, standing slowly. Jon helped her up. Robb's eyes met Jon's. They're using our faces. Her fears, Jon nodded grimly. And if they're already inside the walls, they'll take Winterfell from the inside out. Bran spoke again, his voice suddenly sharp. You must go to the Heart Tree. Robb turned. Why? Because Winterfell was built with old magic. The tree is still alive, still strong. The shadows fear it, Arya asked. What about the rest of the castle? Jon looked at the broken hall. We hold the gate, we fight. We burn anything that moves wrong. Robb turned to go, but Jon stopped him with one question. Robb, when this is over, what happens between us? Robb paused. He didn't turn back. When this is over, we'll see who's still alive. Then he was gone, the shadow wolves stalking at his sides, and behind him the castle began to scream again. The Godswood was dying. Robb felt it the moment he stepped beneath the broken arch of the inner courtyard. The snow was no longer white. It had turned grey, tainted with ash and shadow. The wind was wrong, whistling low and wet, like it had passed through lungs that shouldn't breathe. And ahead, standing tall in the middle of the grove, the weirwood tree bled rivers of red sap, thicker than ever before. But it was still alive. The face carved in its bark wept. Yes, but not from pain, from warning. Robb slowed as he approached. His shadow wolves uneasy now, ears twitching, eyes darting into the gloom. The trees whispered, not in words, but in the rustling language of old, forgotten magic. It welcomed Robb, but not gently. It knew what he carried, what he had become. He stepped into the clearing, and the shadows recoiled. Where Robb walked, the ground hissed. The blade on his back, still pulsing with dark veins, glowed faintly like it was breathing. The Wraith wolf had returned home, but this time even the spirits of Winterfell watched in silence. He knelt before the heart tree. The cold bit into his skin, but he didn't flinch. Old gods, he said aloud, voice rough, I am Robb Stark. I was your son. I was your sword. He looked up at the bleeding face. You gave me kingship and I failed. You let me die. Let me be forgotten. But I came back. The shadows tried to keep me. My brother turned from me. My house buried me. But I came back. The wind surged, and with it a deep groaning sound came from the tree itself, like it breathed through time. Robb stood. I don't come for mercy, he said. I don't even come for justice. I come to warn you. He pointed his sword at the sky. They are coming. The ones who drink memory. The ones who wear dead faces. The ones who ride the dark tide. And this time they're not coming for thrones or gold. He looked around the grove. They're coming for names, for roots, for blood. A gust of wind nearly knocked him back. The tree's face split with a sudden crack, and a low moan echoed across the yard. The snow around Robb blew outward in a perfect circle, as if something invisible had awakened. Robb blinked, and suddenly he wasn't alone. Dozens of figures stood around the grove, not men, not alive. Ghosts of the north, old kings, warriors, women in fur cloaks, children with eyes like wolves, all translucent, all watching him, silent. The blood of the first men, the ancient ones, they did not speak, but their presence filled the air like thunder. Robb lowered his sword. You remember me, he whispered. One stepped forward, an old man with antlers woven into his hair, face lined with scars, eyes black and deep. He stared into Robb's soul and nodded once, then lifted his hand and pressed 2 fingers to Robb's chest. And just like that, He felt it, the old magic, the true blood of the North awakening inside him like fire on frozen skin. His heart pounded. His mind opened. The shadows around him hissed and backed away. His sword blazed, not with shadow this time, but with light. Blue, pure and wild, he fell to one knee, gasping. The voice echoed, not in his ears, but in his bones. "You carry the shadow." "But you are still wolf." Robb staggered to his feet. The spirits were fading now, the wind calming. But the fire remained inside him. He understood now. The Wraith wolf wasn't a curse, it was a weapon, and he had just become something far more dangerous than he'd ever dreamed, half shadow, half wolf. But now, blessed by the old gods, and not a moment too soon, a horn sounded, not from within the castle, from the walls. One of the watchmen, still alive, still screaming. Robb turned, sword blazing in his hand. The dark tide had breached the inner yard. He ran, snow and ash flying under his feet. His shadow wolves howled as they followed. Back into the halls of Winterfell, where Jon Snow held the gates, Arya bled in the snow, and the last light of the North flickered in the dark. Robb didn't know if they would survive, but he knew one thing for certain. The shadows had come for the wolves. But this time, the wolves were ready to bite. Winterfell burned, not with fire but with shadow. The halls ran thick with black mist, pouring like smoke from the mouths of the dead. The dark tide had taken form. Creatures that walked on two legs but moved like broken puppets, their flesh stretched, their faces borrowed from the long dead. They crawled through the cracks, through shattered windows, through old stone that had stood for 1,000 years, and yet, in the heart of the chaos, the Stark stood. Jon Snow was covered in blood, not his. His sword arm trembled from exhaustion, but Longclaw still cut through the enemy like a reaper. Arya, silent as death, moved like a wraith between monsters, her twin blades dancing through necks and tendons. Bran remained at the center of the hall, unmoving in his chair, whispering things no one could understand. His eyes rolled back, lost in the endless storm of time. And then the doors burst open. Robb Stark entered like a storm, reborn. The moment his boots struck the stone, the shadows recoiled. His sword, glowing bright with the fire of old magic and shadow wrath, cut the air with light. His wolves leapt ahead, tearing into the creatures with terrifying rage, their fangs leaving trails of fire in the darkness. Jon turned, his face marked with soot and fury. "You came back." Robb didn't slow. "I never left." Together the brothers fought, not as king and traitor, not as past and present, but as wolves. The throne was forgotten, the crown meaningless. What stood in front of them was not politics. It was the end. The battle blurred. Robb lost track of time. Hours, minutes, every blow drained him. The shadows never stopped coming. They screamed in voices he knew, his mother's, Theon's, even Catelyn's dying breath at the twins. They tried to break his mind, but he didn't bend, because he had already broken and reforged himself in the shadows. He caught sight of Arya, struggling against a monstrous thing that wore Ned Stark's face, its mouth gaping too wide, its sword a branch of bones. She was faltering, bleeding from her side. Robb roared and hurled his blade. It spun through the air and struck the creature through the eye. It fell, screaming not in pain but betrayal. Arya met his eyes, nodded once. They were Stark's. They would not fall. Bran stirred. His eyes snapped open, white and wild. "They've reached the roots," he said softly. "The tree is crying." Jon turned. "What happens if they take it?" Bran's voice cracked. "Then the North forgets. Then the shadows win." Robb didn't hesitate. He turned and ran, back through the bloodied halls, back toward the Godswood, sword reclaimed, wolves at his side. Behind him, the castle trembled as if grieving. When he reached the weirwood, he saw them. 3 of them, tall, thin, their faces smooth and featureless, except for the eyes, pitch black, reflecting nothing. They had pierced the tree's bark with jagged spears of obsidian. The red sap bled like a river now. One turned to him and spoke, not aloud but inside his skull. "You are not one of them anymore." Robb raised his blade. "Then I'll be something worse," He charged. The fight wasn't fair. They moved faster than anything in Westeros. They struck with thought, not steel. One touch nearly shattered his ribcage, sent him flying into the snow. But the magic inside him, gifted by the old gods, forged in shadow, held. He stood again. He bled, he howled, and he killed. One creature fell, then another, his wolves dragging the third into the roots, where it screeched before vanishing into the tree's depths. The spears shattered. The sap began to slow. He had saved the tree, Winterfell would remember. When he returned to the hall, the battle was nearly over. The shadows were retreating, slithering through cracks, leaving behind smoke and silence. Jon stood bloodied, surrounded by fallen friends and monsters alike. Arya held Gendry in her arms. He was still breathing barely. Bran looked, older, worn. They turned as Robb entered, dragging the head of one of the fallen Shadow Lords behind him. No one spoke until Jon asked, "What are you now?" Robb stared at the corpse, then at his brother. "I'm what you made me." Jon lowered his sword. "You saved us," Robb shook his head. "I saved the North. Not for you. For them." He looked toward the broken walls, where sunlight had finally begun to pierce the mist. A week later, Winterfell stood again, weaker, quieter, but alive. Jon offered Robb the crown. He refused. "I don't belong here anymore," he said. "I'm half shadow now, half wolf." Arya stood beside him. "Where will you go?" He looked north, where the world ends. He turned, his wolves following. No songs were sung for Robb Stark, no statues raised. But in the dark places of the world, where the shadows still stirred, they whispered of the Wraith wolf, the king who died, returned, and chose to walk beyond the wall, so no one else would ever have to.